Hey everyone, this is Cohen from EdTech, another episode of our Visionary School Founders series. I'm very excited to talk with Miss Antoinette Kane, the founder and executive director of Little Water Prep, a charter school up in the Northeast, I believe. Antoinette, thank you so much for joining us. How are you this morning?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much, Ian. Thank you so much for having me as well.
Absolutely. So what's really cool about this series, and we're already seeing in some of our latest episodes, is we're hearing a lot of new ideas coming out of the pandemic of school founders like yourselves who are really trying to rethink how we do everything. I think there's no one on the planet who doesn't think education needs a revamping. And school founders are probably the most resilient and ambitious individuals out there. As someone who's founded a couple of organizations, I know that founding a school is way harder. So I'm very excited to ask you just a few questions about yourself and Little Water Prep. And I'd love to start by just asking you to tell us a little bit about yourself and what in your story led to your vision for Little Water Prep.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, first and foremost, thank you for providing me with this platform to be able to share my story and also share the inspiration for Little Water Prep and why it began. And so I really like to think that this journey of founding a school started before I even knew it started. When I was a student myself, I was always hyper aware of what was happening in school. It was a place as a child that offered me a lot of stability and security that I wasn't receiving outside of school. And I always just was really aware of a lot of the inequalities just because I was the gifted and talented student. And I always did really well in school, but that wasn't necessarily the case for my sibling or a lot of my friends and family. And when I went to college as an undergrad at Bard studying sociology, that's when I really dove into a lot of the inequities that exist in our country and in just the history. And I particularly became interested with the points in history in which learning or wanting to learn has been deemed criminal in a way. And we see that a lot throughout our history if we really examine it. And so this looked like studying the history of the modern police in France. It looked like thinking about literacy and slavery in our country and what that means. Right. And so that prompted me to then go into education, and I started working at a high performing charter school in my hometown of Brooklyn, New York. And there I was like, okay, wow, this is so interesting, moving from the seat of the student into the lens of the teacher and being able to, what I really loved about the charter school I worked at was how each and every individual student we looked at as an individual, right? We knew what their personality was, we knew what the student, what their favorite subject was and what supports they need and so on and so forth. But also, I felt a little bit conflicted because I thought that the culture and the environment, specifically the way that we discipline students, that there was a gap, right, between what students' real lived experiences and the ways in which we were treating them and socializing them in school, and how it didn't mirror the actual world that they were going to soon enter and that we would hope they would become leaders in. I also then experienced another charter school that was kind of the opposite, right? The academics weren't the main focus and it wasn't as data driven, but it also had a really great culture and environment. And the kids were allowed to, I guess you could say, be kids more. But then the academics kind of slipped and I was like, whoa. I know that there's a way to do both because I've been doing it in my classroom by myself for these past years. And I was then nominated for the BES fellowship, which allowed me to start my own school pretty early on in my teaching career. And I kind of at first was like, no, I can't do this. This is crazy. But when I dug a little bit deeper, I realized the vision that I had was greater than the skills I would need to build along the way.
Yeah. No, I love that. I appreciate you sharing that background too. What I'm noticing talking to so many founders is that most charter school founders come from other charter schools. And it's like, what I think is so cool about that is that it shows you the real benefit of charter schools generally as an institution, of allowing like people to iterate and then those people to iterate and then those people to iterate. I'm sure your school is going to produce multiple school founders as well, which is super cool. And I think that's also how we're going to evolve the system. I would love to dive a little bit deeper into, so you mentioned you were part of two different charter models, and one had some really strong academics, but maybe was not there on the disciplinary side, and then the other one was the opposite. What was one practice from each of those that you felt like you might want to rethink going into Little Water Prep? So let's start with the first one on the discipline side. And you hear this a lot, we know there's like no excuse to schools and those types of things. I was in a school where, it was a traditional public school, and my students, I did not agree with this policy, but they would get suspended for 10 days for literally like cursing under their breath, which I just think is not like, those are not equivalent punishments in my opinion, but stuff like that happens. So I'd love to hear, what were some of the practices you saw in each of those environments that you are going to rethink, and how are you going to rethink them?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, for the first school, I think that it all trickles down, right? It's a trickle down effect. So before I can even comment on discipline, we have to think about the systems and structures in which the leaders are following, and then they are perpetuating to their teachers. And then that affects teacher just work culture and environment, which then again is going to affect students. So the first thing that I was rethinking was how to be as transparent and intentional as a leader as possible, to foster an affirming environment that not only affirms our students, but also affirms the educators who come in and day out, and how we need to create an environment that allows for our teachers to become the quote unquote best versions of themselves, if that's what we expect to draw out from our students. And so I think it really just starts with the mindsets of the leaders. That is really, really key. So making sure that you are finding leaders along your journey who can also help cultivate and craft you and your vision, not steer you away from it, but really just provide you with other experiences and expertise to guide you in this work, as it's very nuanced and ever changing.
Right.
And then I think when it comes to discipline, I just went and totally like reinvented our own sort of culture model. And so for me, I think what my aha moment is a lot of the things that we were considering culture, like monitoring students' bodies on the rugs, the way that they walked, a lot of this like no nonsense, no excuses, compliance-based measures. That's where I was like, okay, there seems to be faults here. And it looks like schools are looking a little bit more like prisons than actual like liberating educational spaces where young children's minds can be molded and grow. And so I created a positive recognition behavior response system, which is essentially is just a reframing, again, with mindsets. And really, really providing our teachers with just the research and the supports to understand student behavior as a need that's not being met, or an expression that they're not able to express. And just that mindset shift of how can we be more solution oriented? These are young people with lots of emotions. How can we model and also teach them how to regulate, identify, and care for those emotions? And so really just moving away from controlling bodies and thinking, okay, though transitions, the way we sit on the rug, those are all operations. That's not our culture, right? Those are just some of the operational logistical things that we need to get so that we can foster that amazing culture, that we can foster those rigorous academics and those just community building moments. And so in my model, just thinking about what is our student culture and how do we build that through self-affirmations every morning, through reflection circles, through restorative practices, as opposed to just thinking about how can I control this student's body to help me get through the lesson for the day. So just that mindset shift, I think, has really been instrumental. And then I think just honoring and embracing our students' identities and meeting them where they are, but also allowing them to define where they want to go and making sure that we're providing them with the knowledge, tools, and confidence so that they can thrive in meeting those goals.
Yeah, I love that. And I think what you said really resonated with me on the discipline side. There's so many folks who, focus on, for lack of a better metaphor, like the leaves on the trees instead of the roots under them, right? I remember in my school, it was very, like my first year, it was like kids can't wear hats and they have to be in the school or in the classroom on time. It's like, but that was all we cared about. We didn't care about anything else. And like, we'd get written up if you didn't take a kid's hat off. And to your point, like that is far down the line of something that's really important. It's like, what are we actually trying to accomplish here? What's the community we're trying to build? What are the values that drive that? So that's really cool that you're starting from a clean foundation of wanting that and not going the opposite way.
And even thinking about building this like collegial environment, which a lot of charter schools connect, like college prep to, early education, elementary school. But just thinking about that environment, it's like when you go to a college campus, people aren't walking in straight lines silently in the hall, right? They're acknowledging each other. They're affirming each other as they walk past. And so really just rethinking what does it mean to build a collegial environment, and that we don't need to strip away our personalities and our identities and the ways that we connect in order to be collegiate, right? That it doesn't have to look that way.
Yeah, definitely. The other thing that I love, and I think it's a good segue into my next question that you mentioned, is starting with the leaders and the teachers, right? And building their capacity to actually deliver to the students. I think that's something that we oftentimes overlook. Like, you want teachers to have their identities affirmed and to have a vision for themselves, because you know that will lead to the students that they have also being able to develop those qualities. So how are you all approaching that with your leadership team and your teachers? What does that look like, trying to help them develop their own vision for themselves?
Yeah, so a lot of the ways in which we've created and built our designs for our school model, and specifically the ways in which that we will develop and support our teachers at their time at Little Water Prep, is really just thinking about myself, because right before I started the school, I was teaching third grade. I was a teacher. I was a grade team lead. I was managing teachers of all different experiences and levels of years in the game. And so for me, the greatest shift going straight from undergraduate into teaching in the classroom was I no longer sat in the seat of a student. And that made me a little bit uncomfortable. And I noticed that a lot of our professional developments, people were speaking at us, but not with us. And we were asked to, these are the deliverables. These are the things that you need to get done. And it became such a bureaucratic process. And I'm like, this isn't why we came into teaching. And if we want to really build an educational institution, then we ourselves have to forever sit in the seat of the lifelong learner. And so something that I built into our interview process and then we'll weave in throughout our year into our professional development is a all staff book club. And this is a time where each month we are reading a collective article or book or text, and it's never going to be directly relevant to education, right? A lot of it is actually just going to be really good, rich literature or history that we should be reading and diving into and being critical of. And so coming together as a staff and using literacy as our medium to begin to start to look introspectively at ourselves and what brings us to this work, why we continue to show up, we're going to use that to really start that conversation. Because we want to have students who are critical thinkers, we also need to be doing that as teachers. And because so much of our school model is about identity affirmation, and really knowing who you are and where you're from, so that when you go out in the world, no one can tell you who to become. That also looks like starting with our teachers, diving into their personal biases, diving into what brought them to the work, what keeps them in the work, what keeps them up at night, and so on and so forth. So that's one way that we have really decided to support our teachers, but also to just support this initiative of creating this an affirming environment where we really just work off of transparency and honesty with one another.
Yeah, no, that's so meaningful. It's such a difference from what a lot of us have experienced. And the point you made about when we go into professional development and training, I mean, it's so funny how universal it is. We all hear professional development and all of our eyes glaze over immediately because it's almost always that way, even though we all know it, right? We just did a webinar on how to retain and recruit teachers. And one of the things we talked about was how your support and growth strategy is actually the best retention and recruitment strategy. But part of that is making trainings and development and workshops, like they have to have applied practice. Like you actually have to get up and do the things. You have to engage, or else you're just sitting there, right? And like, if you want me to sit there and listen and give me a video and a recording, I'll go do it at home. Like I don't need to be there. But that's not effective, right? So I think that engagement, while teachers may, in the moment not be used to it, over time, if you can build that culture, it sounds like it's going to be a much more resilient and dynamic place to work versus,
Yeah.
just
And
passive.
it's just like being about what you say you're about. So for example,
Right.
instead of just sitting in a room during summer PD for 3 weeks and reading like Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain, which is a great book,
Right.
apply that practice. Go out into the community, be culturally responsive, right?
Yeah.
Have your PD out in the community. Just go for an afternoon to the local park and just sit with the kids for no other reason other than just wanting to be there. And I think that that's also a key to how can we bridge the things that we're reading or being asked to do or what the research says and actually applying it to our everyday lived practice.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we started recording, we were talking a little bit about what it's like to be a founder and some of the unexpected challenges that can arise. So one of the things is, one of my questions is about for advice you might have for aspiring school founders. I think anybody who's ever worked in a school has always imagined, oh, how would I do this differently, right? Like if I were to run a school, what would that look like? So what advice do you have for anyone who's considering or maybe one day has aspirations of being a school founder? What's something that you would tell them that you wish maybe you had known at the front end, or just things to lean more into now you've been doing it?
Yeah, I think I have two short pieces of advice or just things I would have loved to hear. Number one, and this is a little bit more personal, which is your vision has to be greater than you. Because if it's not, you're going to get lost in the work. You're going to get lost in the no's. You're going to get lost in the challenges. You're going to get lost when you realize, hey, I can't please everybody in the community, or this school might not be, the thing that everyone was waiting for. And so it's thinking about that dark tunnel. And founding a school, a lot of the times you're not going to see the light at the end of the tunnel, but keep pushing forth and going through the tunnel because it does exist. And even if you never get to be a part of it, you know that your students are going to be able to experience an education that you envisioned, but never got to experience yourself. And then the second one, I think, is just a little bit more realistic and like logistical, I should say, not logical.
Yeah,
and that is, going pretty much overnight from a classroom teacher and school leader to a school founder, there is so much you don't know, and none of it is relevant to education, right? So real estate, zoning, business, finance, all of these different hats that you have to wear and seemingly become an expert in overnight, that's the toughest part. And so my greatest advice is seek the people who know, seek the support. You don't know something about a zoning issue, call up a land use attorney, right? You don't know something about finance, get a really good treasurer to serve on your board and to support you with that. And so really it's just about, as a leader, knowing what you don't know and being able to leverage the people who do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it goes for any entrepreneur too. And we see this all the time. It's we convince ourselves, and teachers, I think, are the most equipped to be entrepreneurs, but also at most risk of trying to do too much on their own, because that's what we're trained to do, right? As a teacher, your MO is, I'm going to make it work. I'm going to do as much as I need to do. But when it comes to starting to build something bigger than yourself, as you said, you need to start leveraging other people's expertise. That board is so critical. And most charter schools that do fail, they fail because they didn't manage their finances properly, or they missed important legal things. And so I think that's such a great point. And it's mundane, and it's not why you get into the work, but like that's what running and building a school looks like, right? It's bigger than yourself. It's an operation that runs, and you've got to play that game too. So I want to close on a question about the future. I personally always love to try to get people to tell us more about what the future of education should look like. I think a lot of times we focus so much on the challenges today because there are so many, but what we need actual visions for the future. And so when we think about education, K-12 specifically, looking out just 10 years, what do you hope is true about education in 10 years? So we're looking at 2032. I had to look down at my computer for the date. So in 2032, it can be something small, it can be something big. What do you hope is true 10 years from now?
Yeah, well, that's definitely a huge question. It's something I think about often. And I would say for me, I just think as a society, as a collective, that we move more away from the institutional aspects of schooling and what it has become and how systematized it's become, and really are honoring just traditional ways that we educate. And so really I envision education being a much more collective, community-based effort. And I also, if we're thinking about K to 12, I would love to just see some more like intergenerational collaboration. So thinking about how our kindergartners can learn from our middle schoolers can
Yeah.
learn from our high schoolers, and how education is not just what happens behind the four walls of a school. In fact, it's everything that happens outside of it,
Right.
and how we can break down those barriers. And I want to walk into schools and I want to see children get, you know, putting meals together and then sitting down and eating them. I want to walk into schools and I want to see children questioning the things that they're reading in their textbooks, and being prompted and affirmed to question, and to think critically. And most importantly, I just want to see an equitable system. I don't know if that can happen in 10 years, but that just honors our students, and just education that is deserving of them. Because right now, I think just across the board, our education is not deserving of our students. And so we need to just really, really think about how we learn, and how we can foster spaces for students to feel smart and intelligent in a variety of forms and not just in one way.
Yeah, no, I mean, themes that have come out of this really is, culture, relationships, identity is obviously very important to you and your school. And I love that last intergenerational piece. I mean, do you think about how important siblings and cousins are to our upbringing, but we never sort of blur those lines as much in the school system anymore. There are some models out there in other places that do that, but yeah, I love that. So this has been awesome. I appreciate you taking the time again. This has been another episode of our Visionary Founder series with Antoinette Kane, the founder and executive director of Little Water Prep up in New York, a charter school. Antoinette, I really appreciate you sharing your time. I'm going to stop the video. You can hang on for a few seconds afterwards, but this has been really great. We appreciate you sharing your vision with us.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me.